Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington presents World Focus, a continuing series on international political, social, economic, and cultural issues.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 1987 Samuel and Althea Stroum Lectures in Jewish Studies. My name is Hillel J. Kival. I am chairman of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Washington. This lecture series was established in 1975 by the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle to honor the efforts of Sam and Althea Stroum on behalf of higher Jewish education and the university at large. It has from the beginning served as a cornerstone of the Jewish Studies program at the university and as a unique vehicle for the transmission of Jewish learning to the wider public. This year's lectures, which will be delivered by Robert Alter, are sponsored by the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies, the Jewish Studies program of the University of Washington, and the Endowment Fund of the Jewish Federation. Robert Alter, who is professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California at Berkeley, was born in New York City in 1935. A summa cum laude graduate of Columbia College, he went on to do graduate work in comparative literature at Harvard University, where he received the PhD in 1962. Alter has taught at Berkeley since 1967 and has been a full professor there since 1969. Over the course of his career as scholar and literary critic, Robert Alter has won numerous fellowships and awards. He's been a Danforth Fellow, a Senior Fellow with the National Endowment for the Humanities, twice a Guggenheim Fellow, and also a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Alter's book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, received the National Jewish Book Award for Jewish Thought in 1982, and it has recently appeared in a Hebrew translation. His 1985 work, The Art of Biblical Poetry, won the Present Tense Literary Award in the category of religious thought. As one member of our own English department recently wrote, "These two books on biblical art have given a whole generation of readers new eyes with which to read the Hebrew Bible." Robert Alter's contributions, however, are not confined to interpreting the Hebrew Bible. He has written important studies on the picaresque novel, on modern Hebrew literature, and on the life of Stendhal. Even a partial survey of the titles of his more than 90 scholarly articles reveals the breadth of his intellectual interests. The genius of S.Y. Agnon, poetry in Israel, confronting the Holocaust, Shabtai Tzvi and Jewish imagination, on Walter Benjamin, the letters of Gustave Flaubert, the American political novel. For the 1987 Stroum Lectures, Professor Alter has chosen the topic, The Invention of Hebrew Prose, Literary Language and the Dilemmas of Mimesis. Mimesis is a Greek word meaning imitation or representation, and its use in literature reflects the notion that literary works can be seen as representing in some way the real world. Tonight's lecture is entitled From Pastiche to Nusach. As many of you know, the Stroum Lectures have resulted in the publication of some important and influential books. In this connection, the editors of the journal Shema have written the following. If the Stroum Philanthropic Fund of the Seattle Federation had only made these lectures possible, it would have nobly justified its establishment. May other donors and federations speedily emulate its work and reach its high accomplishment. We are confident that in the selection of this year's speaker, we have more than matched our own high standards. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Robert Alter.
Thank you, Professor Kiva. Mr. and Mrs. Stroum, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be saying a good deal in these lectures about language, and I don't want those of you who happen not to be students of linguistics or literature to panic. That is, I promise by and large not to use terms more complicated than syntax, past, present, and future when I'm talking. I wanted 2 points to be perfectly honest. I will be forced to use a more technical term. When I do, I promise that I will explain it. Also, those of you who don't know what nusach is, when I get to that point in my lecture, I will explain what it is in general and what it is in connection with Hebrew prose. I would add this last prefatory comment that even if you're not a student of language or language and literature, and it's the literary use of language that I'm going to be focusing on, it seems to me that this is one of the most essential dimensions of our existence as human beings. So that is, I don't think this is a subject that we can afford to ignore or leave in the hands of the specialists. And I'm going to make an argument that the particular kind of literary use of language, which I'll be describing in these lectures, has rather large implications for the course of modern Jewish history. The fashioning of a living Hebrew prose as an instrument of realistic fiction is one of the most astonishing chapters of modern literary history. It was carried out on European soil before the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language by a handful of daft elitists writing for barely visible audiences with scant encouragement and only the most threadbare means of material support. The first Hebrew novel did not appear until 1853, a full century after the new literary movement known as the Haskalah, a term which means both to possess understanding and to impart it to others, until a century before the Haskalah was launched in Prussia by the Circle of Moses Mendelssohn in emulation of the rationalist, cosmopolitan, and sublime aesthetic values of the European Enlightenment. The earliest Hebrew novels were didactic, technically awkward, and stylistically wooden, but quite implausibly, by the 1890s, fiction of eccentric genius was being produced in Hebrew, and a decade later there were subtly persuasive expressions of psychological realism that seemed perfectly comfortable with the nuanced modulations of style of European modernism. This literary revolution was brought about by writers whose native language was Yiddish, whose general reading, for the most part autodidactic, was in Russian, occasionally in German, and who would not have even agreed altogether on how to pronounce the texts they produced. Their unlikely success at inventing Hebrew prose before there was spoken Hebrew offers striking evidence of the powers of cultural renewal latent in the Jewish people on the brink of modernity, and also raises instructive questions about certain received notions concerning the roots of the mimetic language of the novel in ordinary speech. Language will be our concern throughout these considerations, so we need to have some sense at the outset of the historical peculiarity of Hebrew. Let me stress what every student of Hebrew literature or Jewish history recognizes as the most self-evident fact, that Hebrew, in the 2,000 years of its dispersal, was never a dead language. It had ceased to be a vernacular with the exception of certain regional pockets in ancient Palestine by the time of Jesus. But for the next 2 millennia, it continued to serve a variety of literary uses, both sacred and profane, and to develop through time, absorbing foreign influences, changing structurally, expanding lexically. The most clear-cut continuity is in poetry. From the 7th century to early modern times, liturgical Hebrew verse in a wide variety of forms was composed in Palestine, Iraq, Yemen, North Africa, Spain, Italy, France, and elsewhere, and was regularly used in the synagogue. Toward the end of the 10th century in Andalusia, a new secular poetry, at first self-consciously emulating Arabic models, began a rich literary tradition that was carried on and modified from Spain, Portugal, and the Provence to Italy and Holland as late as the 18th century. The one form of belletristic narrative prose in this tradition, the makama, or itinerant frame story composed in rhyme prose with verse insets, is really an adjunct to poetry and would offer no real precedent for modern fiction, apart from a rare episodic borrowing by later writers for comic grotesque passages. Over the centuries, Hebrew prose carried out other tasks as the vehicle for devotional tracts, for philosophy, most conspicuously when the works of the great medieval Jewish philosophers were translated from Judeo-Arabic into Hebrew as the Jews were driven or migrated from Arabic-speaking Iberia. Also for chronicles, community records, legal discourse, biblical exegesis, wills, international commercial correspondence, and so forth. Only a language of abundant resources could have conducted all this varied business for more than 1,500 years, but it was nevertheless a very different order of business from that of a 19th century novelist describing the nervous flirtation between future lovers, or a fat man trying to button his overcoat in a pelting rainstorm, or the look of an urban landscape enshrouded in fog. The would-be Hebrew novelist a century ago had inherited a language that was lively and various, but not lively and various to his specific purposes. The rise of the novel in 18th century England offers, at least on the surface, a perfect counterexample to the linguistic peculiarity of Hebrew. It could not have happened, literary historians have long contended, without the famous rise of the middle classes. It was their plain-spun mercantile idiom, according to one familiar account, that displaced the rhetorically ostentatious and more Latinate language of the writers who had received traditional schooling. It was their language that became the norm of the new genre, the formal guarantor of its authentic representation of reality. By this late point in the history of criticism, we are all aware that any literary use of language is in some way an artifice, that the notion of a transparently referential language is a will-o'-the-wisp. But it is plausible enough that the illusion of transparency effected by the first English realists was nourished by the way they could draw on the colloquial, hitherto subliterary traits of the ordinary spoken language of their time. This is the argument that the critic Hugh Kenner recently made in a suggestive essay, The Politics of the Plain Style. From an early moment in that period of emergent realism, he quotes a 1667 text by Bishop Thomas Sprat commending, quote, a close, naked, natural way of speaking, unquote, which is precisely to the stylistic point of the new genre. Such a way of speaking in print, Kenner proposes, generates trust in the reader, however undeserved, that the truth is being told, and so makes possible the enterprise of realism. What then was the aspiring Hebrew realist to do? He had no naked, natural way of speaking to imitate, no living language of merchants and artisans, but on the contrary, only a heavily layered language associated with figures whom Bishop Sprat might well have denounced as mere wits and scholars. In Hebrew, that would be Talmidei Chachamim. I refer, of course, to pervasive questions of diction, tone, idiom, rhythm, and syntax, setting aside the immense but more mechanical challenge faced by Hebrew writers 100 years ago in simply having the words to say wristwatch, railroad station, cigarette, samovar. To gauge the difficulties facing the Hebrew novelists in the latter half of the 19th century, one has to imagine Defoe trying to write Moll Flanders and Robinson Crusoe, or Richardson trying to write Pamela and Clarissa in Latin. Latin, like Hebrew, was in continuous literary use through the late Renaissance for discursive writing and poetry. One recalls that both Milton and Donne wrote Latin verse. But it was, of course, irrelevant to the new serious representation of contemporary everyday reality, which culminated the vernacular revolution in European literatures. Hebrew, on the other hand, was not a lingua franca of the erudite, but had powerful associations with the concrete historical experience of the Jewish people. It was at once a learned language, the possession of an educated elite, and symbolically, though not actually, a popular language. And I think that paradox, both a learned and a popular language, explains a lot of the phenomena that we're going to be studying. Consequently, 19th century writers striving to create a new Jewish culture that would be an integral part of European modernity conceived the paradoxical project of representing quotidian reality in a language nobody spoke, but which, under the aspect of eternity that has always been the measure of Hebrew literature, everyone ought to have spoken. In this seemingly and we'll be getting on to concrete examples of this strange idea a little bit later. In this seemingly quixotic undertaking, the distinctive historical linguistics of Hebrew constituted both a problem and, in the course of time, the beginnings of a solution. Hebrew, as I've said, has been in continuous literary use for about 3,000 years. Because of the powerful authority of the Bible for all subsequent Hebrew writers, both religious and secular, the earliest stages of the language have remained intelligible to and adaptable by modern readers. That is, Hebrew is intrinsically conservative. There are not two languages like modern and classical Greek, but rather a development within the same language, encompassing changes perhaps no greater than from 16th century English to contemporary English, maybe 15th century, perhaps I'm exaggerating. To be sure, 3,000 years in contacts with many different languages, Akkadian, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Persian, Arabic, and so forth, have produced half a dozen or more historical strata of Hebrew. But for the purposes of literary style, it will suffice to keep in mind the two major historical layers, biblical and rabbinic Hebrew. The two differ significantly, despite manifold continuities, in grammar, syntax, and vocabulary. The Bible works with a relatively limited vocabulary, perhaps because its narrative conventions involve very little descriptive specification, and in fact the vocabulary of poetry is bigger in the Bible. The prevailing syntax is paratactic, that is, a stringing together of parallel structures without much syntactic subordination, and being the most common connective term between clauses. This is what linguists call, and experts in style call, parataxis. The verb system, at least as we understand it now, seems to involve only two tenses, the perfect and the imperfect, with a hazier borderline between past and future actions than in European languages. All this changed in the new Hebrew of the sages that emerged in the last 2 centuries BCE and that was put to literary use in the primary code of rabbinic law, the Mishnah, 3rd century CE, and in the Midrash beginning in the 4th century CE. At least in part through the pressure of the Aramaic vernacular, and Aramaic is a closely related sister language to Hebrew, at least part through the Aramaic pressure, Hebrew now was given a clear-cut past, present, and future, together with an iterative or habitual past, that is, actions that are repeated over a long period of time. He would go every day to the bathhouse. That would be an iterative. Certain archaic grammatical forms were now regularized and simplified. The biblical habit of parataxis was frequently set aside for the causal and relational specifications of a syntax of subordination, that is, words like because, inasmuch as, nevertheless, while, and these are the kind of connectives I'm talking about. And to that end, a whole spate of new subordinate conjunctions, such as the ones I've illustrated, was introduced into the language. The legal discourse of the Mishnah involved naming the minute details of realia, and in parallel fashion, the familiar anecdotal style of the Midrash often required an evocation of the bathhouses, the slave markets, the inns, the imperial courts of the late antique world. And so the language of rabbinic literature, this is in contrast to the Bible always, is flooded with new terms specifying everyday realities, borrowed from Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, plus a few other sources. But those are the main ones. The choice between biblical and rabbinic Hebrew was a crucial one for early modern Hebrew literature. Although the prose of the Haskalah was by no means, remember that term once more, Haskalah is the Hebrew Enlightenment. The prose of the Haskalah was by no means consistently biblical. It evinced a pronounced biblicizing tendency. There were both negative and positive motives for this seemingly odd preference. Rabbinic Hebrew was associated in many minds with the latter-day rabbis, with the narrow learning of shtetl and ghetto, with all that the new literati were trying to put behind them in the creation of an enlightened modern Hebrew culture. The language of the Bible, on the other hand, had an aura of cultural prestige. Sublime thoughts had been expressed in that Hebrew. It could be imagined as a kind of epic precedent for later literature, breathing the same grandeur and dignity as Homer and Virgil. Here I must mention a peculiarity of Hebrew literary competence that may seem implausible to our own amnesiac age. Over the centuries, most people who have written Hebrew have known the Bible virtually by heart and have counted on a similar knowledge in their readers. I know this sounds strange, but it's a historical fact. The great medieval poets like Yehuda Halevi and Shlomo ibn Gabirol made their text an unbroken weave of intricate biblical allusions, very often producing extraordinary resonances by playing their own experience against the recollection of the biblical passages from which they draw their language. But the Haskalah writers, with a self-consciousness in their relation to biblical antecedents, of which their literary predecessors had been free, transformed this tradition of allusion into what I would call a cult of the biblical phrase. Melitza is a term that means poetry, or perhaps one should say poesy, rhetoric, and in the 18th and 19th centuries, the high-flown biblical phrase. It was biblical poetry in particular that was mined for such phrases. A figure of speech, a rhetorical maneuver, a recherché term from Isaiah, Job, Psalms, Song of Songs, was felt to have a magic in its mere invocation, to confer special status on the idea or object it was used to express. Thus, a Haskalah writer would not simply say that something soared or bounded, but that it was, quote, like the sparks that fly upward, Job 5:7. A landscape would not be merely pleasing to the eye, but, quote, beautiful of situation, the joy of all the earth, Psalms 48:2. Odessa had to be not just a mercantile city, but, quote, merchant of the people for many isles, Ezekiel 27:3. Even a simple verb like to kiss would characteristically be elaborated into let him kiss with the kisses of his mouth, Song of Songs 1:2, because of the momentum of the lofty scriptural precedent. And this is not an exaggeration. The biblical phrase serves a function in Haskalah writing analogous to the introduction of iconology in mythology in the novels of Balzac. Just as Balzac, self-consciously seeking to elevate his whores and misers and social climbers into the protagonists of immortal art, represents them as Madonnas, Mary Magdalenes, Venuses, Adonises, and Jesus Christs, the Melitza, lifted from classic Hebrew context and slapped down on contemporary realities, was meant by its mere application to give the dignity of the ages to contemporary objects of representation. It's hardly surprising that the style frequently engendered by this cult of the phrase should be a lifeless pastiche of biblical fragments. The first Hebrew novel, Avraham Mapu's The Love of Zion, this is again 1853, is set in the age of Isaiah, and so offers a convenient historical motivation for its rhapsodic biblical style. But when Hebrew novelists turned to the contemporary world, as Mapu himself and others did beginning in the 1860s, their biblicizing bent led them into enormous difficulties. Because nobody actually spoke Hebrew at the time, the contradictions are most spectacular in dialogue, as, for example, when a husband tries to calm his shrewish wife irritated by the household help in words like these: comfort thee, for the Lord hath given thee rest from thy sorrow and thy trouble and from the hard labor. The quotation is from a short novel called, with a didactic flourish, Learn to Do Well. That's in Hebrew, Limdu Hetev. Published in 1862 by a 26-year-old writer named Shalom Yaakov Abramovich. In 1868, he would reissue it with substantial revisions and a new Turnyagevin title, Fathers and Sons, Ha'avot v'Habanim, by which it has since been known. The novel, Abramovich's first, was a teetering, ungainly thing, as he himself clearly sensed. For after revising it, he gave up on Hebrew for the next 18 years. And some of his peers were not so prudent. And writing a brilliant series of satiric novels in Yiddish about Jewish life in the Pale of Settlement, through the mediating persona of Mendele, the bookseller, he became the acknowledged grandfather of the Yiddish novel. When he returned to Hebrew in 1886, producing new stories and reworking his Yiddish novels into Hebrew, he was in a position to become one of the prime inventors of modern Hebrew prose. In order to appreciate the difficulties he overcame, we should first have a brief look at the Hebrew Abramovich before Mendele. Fathers and Sons offer certain signs of stylistic vigor, and the writer's mastery of the whole range of historical resources of the language is evident. But one constantly feels a kind of undertow of biblical usage that pulls the characters toward depths that have nothing to do with their represented experience. The absurdities, as I have said, are most patent in dialogue, but the narrator himself often has difficulty in fighting free from the cult of the phrase. That is my paraphrase for Militzah. Here is a brief evocation of further domestic hullabaloo presided over by the ever-irate Sarah, whom we observed a moment ago as the object of her husband's words of comfort. And now, I'd like you all to turn to the handout, and I'll just say a couple of prefatory words about these handouts we'll be using. That is, to begin with, I'm working on the assumption that, except for a tiny handful, you will not be familiar either with the writers I'm going to be discussing or with the works of fiction I'm going to be discussing. So partly to give you a little taste of what they're like, I've prepared these translations. But also, it seems to me that when you're talking about a phenomenon like style, you have to see how it works in the concrete. And so far, I've been giving you how it works concretely. So far, I've been giving you smooth-sounding generalizations about 3,000 years of the history of Hebrew. I would like to make an effort from this point onward to be more precise by way of illustration. A last word about the translations. I have made them fairly literal in order to highlight certain features of the Hebrew that I want to discuss with you. At the same time, of course, in order not to be utterly barbaric, I've done what I could to make them sound like English prose. Any translation, as you all know, is a compromise. I will explain what the underlining is doing after I read the passage. After a few minutes, one could hear from Shimon's room voices talking, the voice of Ephraim and the voice of Shimon. And in the cookhouse, a voice from the heights was heard, Sarah rebuking the people of her house, and servants rushing off, hastened and pressed, and the cry of roosters and fattened geese rose to the heavens. The phrases I have emphasized typographically are all drawn from familiar classical Hebrew sources. It is immediately apparent that about half the words in the passage, you can just see that typographically, are assemblages of such prefabricated units, by no means an untypical proportion for Haskalah prose. There is only one non-biblical allusion, the word rushing off, yechafezun, which, though only a single word in the Hebrew, would have been recognized by readers because of its unusual grammatical form as a term from the solemn Unetanet Tokef prayer from the High Holiday Liturgy, in which angels rush off, umalachim yechafezun, as the dread day of judgment approaches. Let me spell out the biblical allusions. A simple indication of two men talking, the voice of Ephraim and the voice of Shimon, echoes a repeated refrain in Jeremiah, the voice of gladness and the voice of joy. The link reinforced by an intertextual rhyme, Shimon and Sason, that is, you have Kol Shimon, Kol Sason. By the way, the very existence of an intertextual rhyme shows you how intimately the modern texts are woven together with the ancient texts. Whether or not the cookhouse, or perhaps kitchen, such terms being often uncertain in 19th century Hebrew, is supposed to sit on a second story, or whether the lady is standing on a bench, a voice from the heights was heard, Sarah rebuking the people of her house, so that the narrator can introduce a joking citation of Jeremiah 31:15. A voice from the heights was heard, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. With the last phrase being a reversal, that is Sarah rebuking the people of her house, rather than a citation of the biblical source, rebuke instead of weeping. Even the scurrying about of the servants, hastened and pressed, dechufim uvuhulim, invokes a biblical formula, the urgent haste of Ahasuerus' messengers in Esther 8:14. It would have been easy to choose a text from Fathers and Sons in which the biblical allusions were mere dead weight, in which the young Abramovitz was simply in thrall to the magic of the Mlitzah. And that is generally true of the earliest version. Our example is more instructive, I believe, about the style of the later Abramovich, precisely because of the ambiguous function of its allusions. In the original version of 1862, the passage is a pastiche of inert citations, mostly biblical. When Abramovich subjected the novel to a final revision in the 1912 edition of his collected works, from which I've quoted, he tried to introduce changes in keeping with his later stylistic practice, which I'll be talking about soon, but he was not altogether successful. Clearly, some attempt has been made to generate a comic dissonance between the classic phrases and the modern scene they are made to describe. Instead of a compassionate mother Rachel, a scolding matron Sarah. Instead of rushing angels, an allusion already present in the 1862 version, or messengers, we have domestic servants. But the invocation of the voice of gladness and the voice of joy seems gratuitous. And even the allusions to weeping Rachel and the Persian imperial messengers remain rather unfocused, leaving a margin of doubt as to whether a real satiric point is being made or whether the prose is simply trapped in a kind of Hebrew echo chamber. The predominant style of Fathers and Sons is biblical, in accordance with Haskalah practice, though there are insets of rabbinic language of varying size. And when Abramovich revised the novel in his old age, he made these much more important, much more abundant. What is historically significant in regard to the adaptability of the strata of Hebrew to new literary uses is that this text, which remains awkward even after 2 revisions, exhibits the beginnings of a division of labor between the 2 Hebrews. Let me offer one example where such a division is used to give a special Hebrew definition to a familiar narrative convention of the 19th century European novel. Instructively, the earlier version lacks the rabbinic component and is a good deal more biblically florid. The shift from biblical to rabbinic is far more evident in the Hebrew than in translation because it involves not only diction, the choice of words, but grammar. As the narrator moves from the biblical tense system, you remember those 2 tenses, perfect and imperfect, to the rabbinic. In this case, the historical present, that is, present for past, a device used in several European literatures, but also adumbrated in the Midrash. Here I will italicize not just biblical citations, but all conspicuously biblical locutions. The passage begins chapter 4 of the novel. This is excerpt 2. The doors of the gates of the east were opened. The dawn came forth in purple raiment in honor of the approaching day of Hoshana Rabbah. And from the brightness before it, the borders of the heavens reddened, and all the houses of the city were revealed, and the capitals of the houses of prayer, builded as for an armory, turned gold, and Hebrews moved through the streets. I've, of course, deliberately tried to affect a biblical diction in my English. Some go down to bathe in a place of water. Others come up from there with dripping earlocks. Some, wearing holiday garb, go to the house of God, carrying palm branches and citrons. The Novelistic Convention Abramovich adopts here is to begin a scene with a panoramic overview, including nature, then to move in the focus to a crowd of people within the large scene, and then to settle on a particular figure or set of figures. The sentence after the one where our excerpt breaks off begins with the words, "a certain woman." An exemplary instance, by the way, of this convention is the opening passage of Dickens's Little Dorrit, which moves from a panorama of the port of Marseille to a view of the houses, to the prison, and then to one cell within it. It's really a kind of slow-moving zoom lens before the invention of cinema. Interestingly, Abramovich makes this narrowing of focus correspond to a shift in historical strata of Hebrew. Biblical language is associated by Haskalah precedent with nature and the sublime. So, the first stage of the description here is heavily biblicized, with the intention of giving the scene a grandeur that is both epic and lyric. There are a couple of explicit citations from "the brightness before it or him" is a phrase from David's victory psalm, Psalm 18, and "build it as for an armory," Banui l'talpiot, is an often invoked rhetorical flourish of obscure meaning from the Song of Songs 4:4. The image of the dawn coming forth in bright raiment alludes more obliquely to the simile of the dawn as bridegroom in Psalm 19. Otherwise, the biblical character of the language is a matter of poetic diction, and some of this is evident only in the Hebrew. The word for city, for example, is not the usual ir, but the loftier kiryah. The epic distance through style continues as far as the first mention of people. The inhabitants of this small town in the Pale of Settlement are not Jews, but Hebrews. They do not bustle or crowd through the streets, but more decorously and more vaguely move. V'na'u ivrim bachutzot. Then the grammar, syntax, and vocabulary all shift to the more intimate forms of rabbinic Hebrew as we watch these ear-locked Jews armed with the appurtenances of the holiday ritual heading to synagogue. Abramovich does not maintain this separation of styles with perfect consistency. In a thoroughly rabbinic sentence, he cannot resist a biblical and hence epic reference to the place of worship as a house of God, that is Beit HaElohim, rather than synagogue, Beit Knesset. And in the next sentence, after a particular woman is introduced in the historical present, when she reaches the doorway of the synagogue, quote, "the well springs of her tears burst open, and she shed them before him who dwells in the heavens." The biblicizing is apparent not only in the use of poetic cliche and epithet, well springs of her tears, him who dwells in the heavens, but also in the fact that the entire clause falls into the symmetrical cadence and neat division of biblical poetic parallelism. That is, two utterances that say more or less the same thing with the same number of accents. As with the biblical resonances at the very beginning of the passage, the invocation of Scripture is dictated by a concern for dignity. In this case, not the dignity of the sublime, but the dignity of pathos. Elsewhere in this novel, biblical language is also flourished with echoes of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes when the narrator strives for didactic generalization, which he conceives to be philosophic statement. In all these instances, Abramovich falls prey to the Haskalah illusion that the subject could be elevated by the mere act of bedecking it with language from the corpus of text that had been redefined by the new aestheticizing Hebrew writers as the model of high culture. In his later phase, he would altogether abandon the pursuit of the sublime, concluding that the Bible had to be inserted in contemporary reality in a radically different way, though even the later Abramovich would never entirely free himself of the false allure of pathos. During the 2 decades after the publication of Fathers and Sons, Abramovich, who now signed his books with the name of his persona Mendele, that is Mendele Mocher Sfarim, Mendele the bookseller, worked steadily at unlocking the literary resources of the actual East European Jewish vernacular, Yiddish. When he returned to writing Hebrew in 1886 with the story Hidden Thunder, Beseter Ram, he was no longer content to use the language as a stiff brocade of ornamental phrases from the classic sources. Although Hebrew was still strictly a literary language, its revival as a spoken language would not build momentum until the 2nd and 3rd decades of our own century, and then, of course, chiefly in Palestine. Abramovich now sought against all historical logic to make Hebrew sound as though it were the living language of the Jews about whom he wrote, to give it the suppleness, the colloquial vigor, the nuanced precision of reference of the Yiddish he had fashioned during his years of growth to artistic maturity. Amazingly, he succeeded in effecting this transformation of style beyond all reasonable expectation. Suddenly, in both the language of the narrator and in the dialogue, characters seem not paste-ups of phrases from the sources, but figures that might really have lived in the 19th century shtetl, vigorous inhabitants of an as-if Hebrew world. On the simple level of description and narrative report, it is suddenly possible to evoke with the most vivid persuasiveness 2 Jews sitting in a bathhouse, or a man patiently filling his pipe, lighting it with a glowing coal held in tongs, puffing it up, relaxing into the pleasure of a leisurely smoke. How did Abramovich bring all this about? His most decisive move was to set rabbinic rather than biblical Hebrew as the normative framework of his prose. This shift made possible a greater precision in the system of verb tenses, a more flexible and varied syntax that allowed more nuanced specification of relations among statements, and a wealth of vocabulary, even excluding new coinages in which Abramovich had some share, for naming the minute acts, the physical appurtenances, the colors, textures, and smells of ordinary experience. There was also a certain tonal fit between the Jews of the Pale who inhabited Mendele's stories and novels and the Hebrew in which they were represented. For at least the males among them were, after all, study house Jews who since childhood had been conning Rashi's commentary on the Torah, the Mishnah, early and late compilations of midrashic lore, perhaps devotional tracts or collections of Hasidic teachings and tales. I don't mean to romanticize or exaggerate the learning, which would often have been spotty or skewed, but rather to suggest that the very ne'er-do-well wool gathering of these Jews was done through the idiom of these texts, so that the rabbinic Hebrew in which Mendele represents them is flesh of their flesh, bone of their spiritual bone, even as we remind ourselves that their real-life counterparts would in fact have been speaking and dreaming and counting in Yiddish. Mendele's new prose, moreover, is historically comprehensive. It abounds in biblical elements, used in special ways to which we shall presently attend. But these are now the insets, not the framework. The governing idiom, syntax, grammar, and word morphology are all rabbinic, but other and later layers of the language are represented at points where a nuance is needed or a particular allusion seems appropriate. These later layers would include the liturgy, medieval philosophic prose, the medieval and Renaissance Bible commentaries, rabbinical responsa, poetry and prose from the Spanish belletristic tradition, devotional literature, and at least some of the lexical innovations of Haskalah writing. Chaim Nachman Bialik, the major figure of modern Hebrew poetry, who saw himself as Mendele's disciple, to put that in a time frame, Mendele was born in 1836, Bialik in 1873, 74, came of age around the turn in the late 90s. Bialik, who saw himself as Mendele's disciple and actually translated one of Mendele's novels, The Book of Beggars, in Yiddish, Fishke de Lame, into a Hebrew scarcely distinguishable from the masters, summed up this whole stylistic achievement in a brief essay in 1910 by proclaiming Mendele the creator of the Nusach, Mendele Yotzer HaNusach. A Nusach, Nosach in the proper Hebrew pronunciation that Bialik as a Yiddish speaker would not have used, is a traditional musical mode for chanting prayers in public worship. Anyone with a musical ear can learn a Nusach. Once you know it, you can intone any set of words from the service and so act as prayer leader. And in addition, each holiday has its own special Nusach. Its three most prominent features are transmissibility. Bialik stresses that the Nusach is a collective possession. Adaptability to new circumstances, any text can be sung to it, and its status as clarified, defined form. The Nusach, as Bialik speaks of it suggestively rather than analytically, also bears a strong relation to what a romantic ideologue would call the national genius. Mendele is said to have refined, quote, drop by drop, whatever he found in the treasure house of the people's creative spirit, unquote, so that his personal achievement as stylist ends up assuming, in Bialik's version, a kind of anonymity. Still another metaphor Bialik uses to elucidate his original metaphor. As a poet, he really thought in metaphors. So still another metaphor he uses to elucidate the original metaphor of cantorial nusach is solid coinage. And what this points to is a consistency and unity among the various elements of style that imbue it with a quality of classical wholeness and stability. As Bialik recognized clearly more than 75 years ago, Mendele's new prose quickly became the common means of expression of a whole school of writers. The appeal of the Nusach was so powerful that it required, as we shall see, a willed effort of a new generation of writers to resist it. And though Hebrew today, more than 6 decades after its revival as a healthy vernacular, usually marches to a different drummer, one still sometimes encounters surprising little bits and pieces of Nusach writing in contemporary Hebrew fiction and even, at times, strangely, in Israeli journalism. The creation of the Nusach was in fact, and I don't speak about political speech-making where the Nusach reigns. The creation of the Nusach was in fact an extraordinary achievement, but it also entailed certain limitations upon what could be done in realistic fiction. So if writers had gone no further than the model of Mendele, the invention of Hebrew prose would not have been complete. An extended example may give us a more concrete sense of what this achievement was, and will afford also an opportunity for reflection on the intrinsic limitations of the new style. I've chosen a passage from a story originally written in Hebrew, which will obviate consideration of the intricate issue of self-translation, though it must be noted that the challenge of translating his own prose from Yiddish to Hebrew was a major stimulus for Abramovich's refashioning of the classical language. The story, written in 1890, is called Shem and Japheth on the Train, or more literally, on the wagon, Shem vayefet ba'agalah. For Mendele, the narrator, accustomed to making his circuit in the Pale of Settlement with broken down horses and rickety wagon, is in great bewilderment undertaking his very first railroad trip, and scarcely has the right term for the vehicle. Mendel himself, we should keep in mind, is a Jew in kaftan and earlocks, which is, of course, not the way Abramovich looked. Abramovich was a Europeanized Jew, but Mendel is his fictional creation. So he's a Jew in kaftan and earlocks. The books he peddles are not, God forbid, novels and poems, but prayer books, pious pamphlets, religious calendars. The third-class carriage is overflowing with a bustling crowd of ragtail passengers, most of them Jews, many of them refugees displaced from Prussia by a Bismarckian decree banishing resident aliens. Here in the first chapter of the story is Mendele's initial description of the family in whose company he finds himself. And now we move to excerpt 3. An ill-favored woman with a lean nose was sitting opposite me on a large pillow, from which feathers were sticking out and flying off into the air. Her eyes were timid, the skin of her lips dry and cracked, her face shriveled like a baked apple. Since her arrival, she had not had a moment's rest from her children, who were pestering her with their requests and bickerings. 3 of them, the smallest of the lot, were busy changing places next to their mother, popping up and down and poking her from both sides. In her lap, a baby was drowsing after having wailed till its throat was hoarse. A tear still stood on its cheek, which was bloodless as a mustard seed, and it breathed heavily. And beside me sat her husband, a Jew in all his features, a tall and spare man, his neck lean and his back a bit bent, his nose long and his beard barely grown. There was hidden sorrow in his eyes, and on his lips the hint of a bitter smile. English readers may detect in the energy of the writing, in its touches of caricature, in the note of pathos of the weeping babe, features reminiscent of Dickens, whom in fact Abramovich read in Russian or Yiddish translation. And Gogol would have been another model for such satiric description tinctured with compassion. The very possibility of emulating this 19th century tradition of comic grotesque prose was predicated on Abramovich's embracing rabbinic Hebrew with its capacity for supple syntactic subordination. In the passage we're considering, the sentences are relatively short. Elsewhere, more typically, sentences are long and serpentine, laying out chains of descriptive details through elaborate loops of clause after clause. Quite like Dickens and Gogol is the salient use of simile, shriveled like a baked apple, bloodless as a mustard seed, which Mendele characteristically draws from the homiest domestic details and the most undignified corner of the animal realm: dried prunes, broken plates, blackened pots, rats and lizards, and vermin. Of course, these are not all in this passage, but they're very characteristic of Mendele. What needs some explanation is how this comic grotesque prose is cast in the mold of a distinctive Hebrew nusach. Allusion still plays an important role, but it is more sparingly used and carefully focused thematically, with no suspicion that the writer has simply been caught up in the momentum of the classical phrases. There are only 2 pairs of brief biblical allusions, again I've italicized them, in the passage, a mere 9 words in the Hebrew, but they are both quite telling in different ways. The woman, to render her epithets more literally than I've done in the excerpt, is ill-favored and lean nose, that is ra'at mar'eh v'dakat chotem, like the cows in Pharaoh's dream who are ill-favored and lean-fleshed. I think it's ra'ot mar'eh v'dakot basar. The play on the scriptural verse is a shrewd joke with a large thematic implication. Instead of the expected flesh from Genesis, basar, we get nose, chotem, which serves Mendel's general propensity to imagine the nose as a synecdoche for the whole person, combining, as it were, an observation of Jewish physiognomy with a reading of the famous Gogol story, The Nose. Satirically, the allusion invites us to see the poor woman as an emaciated cow. In this case, the grotesque animal simile is hidden beneath the surface, while the general recollection of Pharaoh's dream also involves the 7 wasting years of famine, which in turn lead to the displacement of Israel from their land and their enslavement in Egypt, all of this being grimly appropriate to the plight of the woman and her family and scores of thousands of Jews like them in the year 1890. So you see how intricately focused the whole allusion is. Everywhere in the Nusach style, allusion measures the gap between the God-governed grandeur of the biblical era and the shambling reality of East European Jewry. Sometimes, as here, the allusion marks both a discrepancy and a similarity between the two historical orders. Elsewhere, it serves merely to expose ironic discrepancy. Mendel's resourcefulness in using allusion in this way is unlimited. And I think that's not an exaggeration, that word unlimited. The story begins with phrases that recall the shouting of the Israelites in the episode of the golden calf. For as always with Mendel's Jews, profit-taking is at issue. Then we see the Jews forcing their way onto the crowded train, quote, with a strong hand and outstretched arm, as God took Israel out of Egypt in the ancient Exodus reported in Deuteronomy. And at the end of the first paragraph of the story, Mendel finds himself shoved next to a woman with, quote, the heaps upon heaps of her belongings and blankets, for me a wall on my right and on my left, the language in which the parting of the Reed Sea is described in another moment from the biblical Exodus. And so it goes from sentence to sentence and passage to passage. The play of biblical insets, sometimes being a local joke, sometimes offering a larger frame of thematic reference, almost always pointing comically to a gap between the biblical source and the modern object of representation.